Hi everybody, welcome back to Permanent Waves. Today I just want to do a quick talk about remasters, particularly when remastering a classic album or a metal album, because this can be a really controversial issue. For one, a lot of fans don't really like their classic records being mucked around with too much, and secondly, people kind of don't see great intentions behind remasters, seeing them as either cash grabs or just ways to kind of bring the record back into the public eye to generate more sales for a moment. But at the same time, I want to talk about issues where I feel like remasters actually do kind of help the record. And there's no greater example of this than the band Megadeth. So Megadeth's first couple records, Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good, Peace Sells But Who's Buying, So Far So Good So What, were definitely recorded on either a shoestring budget or a very limited one, with also many of the band members choosing to spend that budget on, well, other things, like, and I recall Dave Mustaine stating in his biography, craft dinner, cocaine, various things that aren't exactly recording. So when it came time to re-examine Megadeth's early releases back in 2002, it's not exactly crazy idea to think that the first record, Killing Is My Business, needed a bit of a facelift. The bass was really muddy, the drums were poorly produced. It's just a really muddy mix. And so what Dave Mustaine ended up doing was remastering Killing Is My Business, and in my personal opinion, and many others as far as I can read, he did a pretty damn good job. The new mix is a bit louder, and we do have a problem going into 2000 with the loudness war, but I'll get to that in a minute. The new mix chooses to bring out better guitar sounds, better bass sounds, the drums are more clear, the vocals are right up front. It's what you want the record to sound like, while it's still retaining its raw, unbridled energy and aggression that it had in the past. And this is also where remasters can be a bit contentious, because especially with a more raw record, especially you see this in black metal, thrash metal, the more heavier metal genres, a big part of the sound is that it's raw, and it sounds really murky, and it usually sounds more evil that way, which is very true, but at the same time, if it's done for the sake of just sounding that way intentionally making a record sound not very great, just make it sound evil, well, I think that will actually come off as inauthentic and hurt the quality of the record. In the case of remastering the sound, if you can actually make it heavier and bring the sounds out better, that's generally seen as a positive. But anyway, back to Megadeth again for a moment. Peace Sells But Who's Buying had a similar situation, although the original mix was a bit more listenable. It's still pretty raw around the edges, and the remaster did generally help with that for the most part. But then we get to a bit of a conundrum with So Far So Good So What. This is even more so an extreme example than the last two, because So Far So Good So What was not only a product of its time and the conditions and the mental health and the addictions of the band members like the first two records were, it also had a producer who, for whatever reason, turned in a bit of a pedestrian effort, buried the entire mix in reverb. And you listen to So Far So Good So What, if you can find the original mix nowadays, it's muddy, it's unbelievably hard to discern what's going on. For a technical metal record anyways. It sounds dirty, the bass is often completely buried, the drums barely even sound like drums at times, the vocals, Dave Mustaine sounds like an absolute wreck, but that's kind of what's cool about it in a way. It captures a really turbulent, addiction-rattled period in the band's life, especially when they had to oust two of their former band members because of either addiction problems or thievery. And so the original mix is kind of indicative of that time period, although the remaster definitely does it a lot of favors in the sense of actually being able to hear the sounds. And this is a commonality across remasters in general. They tend to give the mix more clarity, more time to breathe, and bring all the instruments out to the fore. So if you're someone like myself who's a bit more of a musician and who likes to actually hear the various parts, a remaster can be very useful in that reason. Even though in this scenario, I will say, as a listening experience, I do prefer the original. It just has more character to it. And finally, this is my last Megadeth example for those people who are just not a fan of Dave Mustaine. Fair enough. He's an interesting figure, and I like him. I like his work. Great guitarist, but anyway, I digress. The album Risk. Now, Risk is a pretty infamous album in Megadeth's discography because it featured Dave Mustaine essentially saying, screw it with the metal, I'm going to try something mainstream, and almost a challenge from Lars Ulrich saying he should take more risks, get it, with his music. And it resulted in Megadeth writing a bunch of calm radio singles and stadium anthems, and it generally was not well received by anybody at time of release. However, if you listen to it nowadays,
it's kind of fun. It's not thrash metal, it's not speed metal, it's not technical, there's not a lot of crazy guitar solos, but you know what? For a mainstream kind of keyboardy, synthy radio rock record, it's a bunch of good songwriters and a good band making something that's quite out of their comfort zone, but they did a decent job of it and it's kind of enjoyable. And then the remaster comes out. Some say a remaster for an album literally 5 years after its release in 2003 might be a little bit unnecessary, and fair enough. Not a lot changes since then, but with the remaster, what Dave decided to do was bring all the metal elements to the fore. But at the same time, kind of took away all those weird, poppy, synthy, downright weird elements that made the album so interesting and so fun to listen to. So there are definitely some people who welcomed the changes, but it was a bit more kind of right down the middle in terms of its reception. So back to the core question, I think a remaster is perfectly warranted if there was some studio meddling involved from the label, or if the original was recorded in some pretty poor definition, or if the album's just not readily available. Like, I am a gigantic Rush fan, like huge. Like I've got the Ruins from Clockwork Angels tattooed on my forearm here. And a lot of my first experience with that band, in terms of, you know, buying up their music, CDs or otherwise, was through the remastered CDs that I found in HMV at the time, which no longer exists in Canada here, but a lot of those albums were remastered. And I was actually able to track down not only a lot of the original vinyls, but some of the original CDs, like the first pressing, and you compare the two. And you know what? The remasters do sound better than the original CDs. Not as good as the vinyl. The vinyl, I'm gonna say this over and over again in this channel, I'm sure. I absolutely adore vinyl, the sound of it, the experience of it, and nostalgia aside, it's the best sound you can get. But the remastered CDs, they definitely give a lot of those mixes a lot more punch, a lot more facelift, and part of that is the time period. In my experience anyway, first pressing CDs, and I can list a few examples of ones that I have, like, you know, I got a bunch of Pink Floyd albums, I had London Calling by The Clash, I had a lot of those Rush records, and I can tell you that a lot of those first pressing CDs seem to have been mastered relatively quietly, and the mix isn't nearly as dynamic as you would expect, especially for a really nuanced band like Rush or Pink Floyd. And so in those cases, the remasters don't really seem to do much bad, because now a new version of that record is readily available for anyone to listen to and really helps us get into those old bands a lot better. So that covers a lot of my thoughts as far as classic albums go, but now I want to talk about a more modern example and one more side of this issue I want to look into. And this is a recent remaster. I want to talk about Paradise Lost's Believe in Nothing. Now, Believe in Nothing is a really weird record. It's a band that started off sounding kind of like a depressed, more gothic Metallica, deciding they want to go and do synth-pop like Depeche Mode for a bit, but then with Believe in Nothing deciding to get a bit heavier, but not quite metal heavier, almost like a late 90s alternative rock heavier, and it sounds really weird. I actually like the record. It has a lot of bangers on it. It's kind of cool hearing all those electronic beats match up with those weird alternative metal riffs with a bit of a gothic atmosphere. But the band have stated for years that they were unhappy with the mix, and also that the label had a lot of interference. The guitarist, Gregor McIntosh, even states the album just simply does not exist for him. So they've been yearning to remaster the album for a long time, and in 2018 they did. And the remastered Believe in Nothing is, well, you're always going to divide people, but this one seems to really divide people, because it, once again, like Dave Mustaine's remaster of Risk, brings the metal elements out and the riffs a lot more, while dropping away some of those weird alternative textures that maybe made it kind of special to a lot of people. Me personally, I think it sounds great. It adds a nice heavy metal distortion opposed to kind of a fuzzy alternative one, and I think that's a really cool contrast with the gothic elements, so I'm happy with that one. At the end of the day here with remasters, I think a lot of it is the intent, and I don't think the metal community should entirely boycott any idea of any album being remastered whatsoever, although the issue, especially when with a much loved record, should be approached with a lot of caution. And this was kind of the experience we got recently with the same band, Paradise Lost, redoing, well, not only remastering, but re-recording the album Icon. And I want to do a whole episode on that one, so I'm not going to say too much here. But yeah, that definitely got people nervous, even though their reasons for doing so were actually quite legitimate and quite good-natured. But it is scary to have something you love, something you grew up with, just maybe changed in a way. I want to remind everybody too, and it might be harder now with streaming, I don't know, that even though the record has been remastered, the original is still out there for you to enjoy. You might need to dig a little bit for it, but just because it's being remastered or being remade or changed in any way now doesn't mean the original is gone.
But I will agree in this case that newer and bigger and redone is most certainly not always better and can get rid of a lot of what made that record so special in the first place. Any record or any piece of art really does deserve to be handled with care in that manner. Much like how the band Yes, when remastering a lot of their albums from the 70s, chose Steven Wilson to do it. Steven Wilson is a veteran of the progressive rock scene with Porcupine Tree and his solo project and grew up on Yes's records and knows exactly how they should sound, so he was an excellent choice to preserve the legacy of those albums. But this isn't always the case with modern records and modern production. Which brings me to my last major point about remasters here, the loudness war. In the mid-2000s, it became a thing to master records extremely loudly, and most notoriously with Metallica's Death Magnetic and even Rush's Vapor Trails to an extent. The mixes are just, as soon as you pop it, if you adjust the volume level to a point where you consider music to be tolerable and you pop either of those albums in, it's going to be louder, much louder than you expect. And the sound, you'll even notice the sound starts to clip with nice headphones on certain frequencies. Maybe it's the drums, maybe the cymbal crashes, it just spits, it crackles, and it's just not a good sound, and it hides some of the nuances. Rush has at least remastered Vapor Trails and remixed it since then, and the new mix, well, it does actually lose some of the earth-shattering punch the original's mix had, because Vapor Trails was a heavy, angry record for that band due to the events in drummer Neil Peart's life. The remix really clears a lot of the mix up. And when you have a band like Rush, you really want to hear all the things those guys were doing with their instruments. It's always going to be a controversial debate, and it's always going to be a case-by-case basis. That's my main message for today, is that I think a remaster is totally okay as long as you keep the essence of the original. You want to bring out instrumental parts that might have been buried, or you want to correct some label meddling or any kind of circumstances that might have affected the original intention of the record and its production. And also, it's not just for a cash grab, it's because you want to breathe new life into a work. You want to make everyone maybe look back on an album that was kind of maligned, like Believe in Nothing or Risk, and say, you know what, there was a lot more here that we didn't get to see back then, and we can see it now, and it's awesome. So that's my rant for today, everybody. Thanks for staying tuned. Keep listening, and I'll see you in the next podcast. Peace out.